What is going on, everybody? So I'm back today to talk about something that I don't normally talk about on the channel, which is a documentary series. I'm a huge fan of documentaries, especially when they're executed really well, and I'm also a huge fan of true crime. I think it is really fascinating psychologically to look at some of these horrible people in our past that have committed some really terrible atrocities and trying to get in their head and understand why they did the things that they did, and also how we can be as a society more observant and perceptive to symptoms and things that might seem unusual with people that might indicate that they are capable of horrendous behavior. The documentary I'm going to be talking about today is looking into the serial killer John Wayne Gacy, which I felt like someone I knew a little bit about but not a lot of detail, and I felt like this documentary really explored all levels and angles of this case in a really fascinating way, and I'll get into it a little bit more in my review. Conversations with a Killer, the John Wayne Gacy Tapes, is directed by Joe Berlinger. He dined with the powerful, he preyed on the vulnerable. Beneath a smiling exterior, he was the horrifying darkness of a sadistic serial killer. So this documentary looks at John Wayne Gacy, who was this horrendous serial killer who was active in the United States from like the early 60s to the mid 70s, which I believe his last killing he was doing was in like 77, 78 maybe, if I remember the timeline correctly. And this film utilizes these tapes that were released just recently that were conversations with him before he went on death row. And amidst you hearing perceptions from him himself, it's you kind of following all of the police officers and people, the lawyers and everyone that were involved in this case, and also interviewing families of people who went missing. So what's really fascinating about this is looking at the early years of Gacy and how he ended up being arrested for the first time in Iowa, where he was living with his former wife for sodomy. He was arrested for essentially raping a young boy. And one of the men who was involved in a case where he did assault him in a way but did not assault him sexually, thankfully, that him and a group of guys were hanging out, and it was this college group of guys that got really drunk, and two of the guys left, which just left Gacy with this young man, and they were playing pool, and he started talking to him about sex. And he ended up pulling out this projector and playing like pornography and then saying like, hey, have you ever experimented with a man? And the guy was like, no, I haven't, whatever. And Gacy left the room and came back with a gun. And he ended up saying like, hey, you're going to do this. You're going to do this thing for me. And then Gacy like broke and said, oh no, I'm just messing with you. I just do this to try to see how people can psychologically break. And then the guy trying to go to bed later that night, and Gacy showing up again in his room with a knife to his throat and doing the same thing, saying, oh no, I was just messing with you. And seeing earlier on in his life how he was showing hints to what he would become and the horrors and the atrocities that he would commit. And watching that man give that recounting statement of that was just horrifying. And like seeing this person who even in Iowa was like, there's this group called the JCs who was like this social club that did all this proactive charity work and did all this amazing stuff, that he was at the forefront of all this, and he was a person who was super beloved in his community. He was an active churchgoer. He was all these things that people would never have expected this person to commit these heinous acts. And what's even more fascinating is listening to him talk about his own psychology. He considered himself a bisexual, but he does not classify bisexuality by what it is to today's standards. He says that his bisexuality is different, and that homosexuality was this vile and horrible thing that were men falling in love with each other, and that his was just purely sexual, and that there's nothing more to it, and that it didn't matter that it was man. But then later on condemns bisexuals even in a very horrible way, to where you can tell being involved in religion early on very much skewed his perception as to what that was. And so that's a really fascinating element of the documentary as well. But I think what was the most horrifying element of this overall, obviously the things that Gacy did and the atrocities that he committed towards these young men is some of the most disgusting and vile things that have ever happened in the history of the United States of America. But I think what really kind of just upset me even more, and that really just shook me up, was the fact that the police force did so little in so many of these cases because they were concerning gay men. And gay men at this period in time during the 70s were treated as second class citizens. And it's really like disgusting to watch these police officers say that there were certain precincts that just kind of pushed these cases to the back because the men were known homosexuals and that they just didn't care as much about it. And it's just horrible to think that this could have been taken care of so much sooner if the police force was more active and in the way that they treated members of the gay community. And it's awful. And then to know how many young 14, 15-year-old boys were murdered because when older men, 19, 20, were being abducted in these queer communities around Chicago, that nothing was done because the police force didn't care about gay people. And that was really the hardest thing to watch, was to know that these young men who were members of the gay community in a time where gay people were already persecuted enough as it is, did not get justice sooner because of that. And there's still a number of people, I believe it's now 5 members on the 33 people that Gacy killed. There are 5 of those young men who have still yet to be identified. There was one, it was insane. Obviously DNA technology didn't really start getting bigger until the past probably 10 years. But there were families that just came out a year to 2 years ago to give dental records and DNA or whatever to get their children identified. And it's just horrible to think about. And it's really just kind of sad and awful knowing Gacy got his just desserts and did get the death penalty, which, you know, there's a lot of conversation in the world about, is the death penalty right? Should people get the death penalty? John Wayne Gacy was a sociopath, a psychopath who knew what he was doing. He with every single fiber of his being knew what he was doing to those young men, and I truly believe that there is no correcting that behavior, that he was a serial murderer, and that if he would have been released back into society, he would have continued to be a serial murderer. And it really, the documentary goes into looking at people's perspective of the death penalty or psychological rehabilitation, and I don't think someone like him, that there would have ever been an ability to psychologically rehabilitate him. I think that he would have more just been a test subject for people to experiment on. But I feel like it's so interesting to see someone who's so devoid of empathy and compassion towards other people. And this documentary looks at so many interesting facets of his psyche, but it also really pays a lot of tribute to these victims and gives their families a platform to speak out on. Like, you watch these documentaries, it's all about the person who committed the acts and not enough about the people who were, their lives were tragically taken. And I feel like this documentary does a good job of putting those people forward and giving them the voice and the ability to speak out and talk about the harm that this caused to their families. And it was really heartbreaking. It was really difficult to watch, but it was also, if you're a fan of true crime, it was a fascinating documentary to watch. So have you seen Conversations with the Killer? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Leave me a comment down below and let me know what you thought. I thought it was a really well-structured documentary that kept me engaged for all 3 parts. As always, if you can like the video and subscribe to the channel, it helps me out a lot and lets me know the type of content you're looking for. I'm always putting out new material and look forward to getting more out for you in the near future. And as always, everyone, thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.